It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome back to another podcast by George. Let's take a break and talk about something that's cool and really interesting that struck my eye, something that I came across on the pages of the newspapers that I peruse, actually, and it's out of the heartland. It's out of the University of Iowa. And to put this in context a little bit, I'm sure that the viewers of the podcast have friends and family that are all up about Ancestry.com, and they're chasing their heritage backwards, and they're looking for their genetic, clues and back. And I have people come to me in my own family and say, how about this? What about that? And I'm like, I'm kind of interested. And other people come up and say, I've got an ancestor that was on the Mayflower. And I tell them, well, unless you're a Native American, I think that's how most of us got here. I mean, that's really not that surprising. But you got to check your heritage. You got to look backwards. And unless you find a relative of mine that's a millionaire that's got a bunch of money to bequeath, I just am not that interested. But this story will make you interested. I mean, it's like a true detective story with medical and genetic information, and it has to do. Well, let's introduce our guest first. This is Mark Olson. He's a physician's assistant. He's out at the University of Iowa, and he's got particular insight and interest, and he's worked on this case. And I want to bring him in here and welcoming to a podcast by George. Hi, Mark.
Hey.
Yeah, good.
Glad to be here.
I'm glad to have you on the podcast. So, all right, I've spent enough time, as old as I am, around some doctors and physicians and stuff, and I've read some medical things, and they oftentimes talk about how issues or cases present themselves. So to get us started here, tell us how this particular case presented itself, if you would.
So, a number of years ago, one of my colleagues who's now retired, Diane Atkins, she came in contact with a patient that had suddenly died. And they had done some of the work up in Wisconsin, and he was 10 years old, and he was just playing baseball, and on the baseball field he just suddenly collapsed and died. He was part of a Mennonite family, so a large family. It's one of the older children. And then a few years later, and we did some initial testing, including genetic testing, but everything we tested at the time, around 2010, was negative. So then her partner, Dr. Law, was on service another time when a brother of that child who died was 11 years old and was playing baseball, and he survived cardiac arrest. And so that's kind of how we knew this family. Is just kind of starting with the two sons, one who did not survive and then one who did.
And a lot of folks will have some experience with this. I mean, people faint, kids faint. It happens sometimes when playing sports. I've seen it on the football field. What do you normally think of when you start to look into a case like? What are some of the more common causes of something like that?
Yeah, you're right. So, depending on what literature you look at, 25% of teenagers are going to faint at some point. A lot of it's exertional. We really think of dehydration. Sometimes you faint because you got the flu and your electrolytes are all off, and again, you're dehydrated. We see wrestlers cutting weight. I see one or two of those every spring, or not spring, but every fall, when they start their practices and they're cutting weight. So there's more normal reasons to pass out. Now in this case, they did start CPR on the second son, and were able to save his life on the baseball field. So it saved a lot of the steps of investigating children who pass out.
And then, so how long was it before looking into this that you started to think that there might be something unique about the background of these Mennonite families and the malady that you were encountering?
Well, I think, so when we got to meet this family, I met them at the same time as Dr. Law when the one child survived. And so as we talked to the family then had stories of other families that had multiple children that had passing out was the number one symptom, and then sudden death. So then we started to really look into it. They had a daughter at the time as well that was older than the first son who had passed away, and she was passing out frequently. But again, all of her testing, genetic testing done at the time, was negative, and she had a normal EKG. Everything else was normal when you ran her on a treadmill or did anything else like that. So it was at the time of the second son who'd survived that there was some indication.
So, and you discounted everything like, flu, viruses, diet, all those common things. I mean, that it didn't take very long. Or did it take a while to figure that out?
Well, when the second son, he survived, he ended up in the emergency room and then the ICU. And in all of that testing they do a panel and look at viruses. They take a history and say, were you sick in any way? And everything was, no, I was normal. Everything was normal that day. I was just playing baseball during the summer.
Wow. And so when did you start to see some revelation and when it came to looking at the blood?
So, yeah, that took a really long time, actually. So, Diane Atkins, with the first son, had done some genetic testing, but our testing was very limited at the time. And so with the second son, so when he grew up to be 11, it was several years later, and we did this even more advanced genetic testing through one of the commercial companies. And again, all of his genetic testing was negative. Now, at the time, and with the University of Wisconsin in Madison, they had one patient that they were also investigating. They were thinking of long QT syndrome, but that was not the case. And in fact, all the testing for that was negative.
Now, what is that?
So long QT syndrome is where every time your heart squeezes, it electrically has to, it's going to squeeze and then it's going to reset. So for every beat. So you get that nice top chamber lub, then bottom chamber dub. So lub, dub. But after the dub, when the big ventricles squeeze, everything resets. And what happens with long QT syndrome, and we've identified most of them to date to be sodium channel or potassium channel defects. And sodium and potassium are electrolytes that are involved in when your cell depolarizes, but also when it repolarizes. And if you have a defect in those channels, the sodium channels or potassium channels, then it can take a really long time to reset. And if the reset time is long enough, then if an extra beat comes in when maybe half of your cells are reset and the other half are not, it can cause ventricular tachycardia or ventricular fibrillation, which is then sudden cardiac death and arrest.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not what they had, but that's what everyone was investigating, and our tools, genetic tools, were best at the time for identifying. But the nice thing is, so the original testing that Dr. Law did on the second son was again more advanced because it was several years later. But the genetic companies retest on negative patients every so many years. So you contact the company, say, it's been 5 years. Can you retest this child? And when they retested him 4 or 5 years later, they found what's called a variant of unknown significance. So a variant of unknown significance is a mutation in a gene it's an area that makes a protein or encodes a protein that is suspected, could cause a problem in one of the channels. And in this case, it was in what's called the RYR2, and it's a ryanodine receptor, and it affects how your cells use calcium, your heart cells use calcium. But we didn't know anything about it. So that was about 2017 when one of the commercial companies said, hey, we found this thing, we're calling it variant of unknown significance, but it's in the ryanodine receptor area. We don't know what to say about this. And so for the parents, for the family, it had been 10 years from when their son died until the first indication that there was something that we could find and identify.
Okay, so when did you become aware that it was actually beyond this one family from 10 years ago?
Yeah, well, so the longer we knew them, the more we got to know other family members that were passing out, and some were dying. And in fact, we identified, I don't know if it made it in any of the newspapers, but there's a journal article that discusses the discovery. I have a copy of it. You probably can't see it. But within it, yeah, I'll have to send you an email with it. But within it, you can see we started to identify other family members. It's very hard to see. Other families that had sudden death. And in fact, one of them that we identified just verbally, just through family history, was one from about 20 to 30 years before. And it's just the saddest story. Every time you see a crossed out line, that means somebody died. And it's a family of 7, the main affected children. And 5 out of the 7, and the ages on here are 2 years old to 12 years old. So 5 out of the 7 children died running or playing, doing recess. One of them was swimming, suddenly. But that was again in the 70s and 80s. They did not have genetic testing. And there are 2 survivors. And then later on in the process, as we were investigating this, Hannah Bombay, our genetic counselor, she actually got in contact with one of the survivors. So one of the sons who'd survived. And interestingly, he had horrible survivor's guilt, which I guess that's not unexpected. That he and one of his sisters had survived, but 5 of his siblings had died. And I think what's hard about this too is, to a certain degree, these children had full personalities, right? This is a 12-year-old, this is a 10-year-old. These are older children. It is actually less common in our findings to find a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old that has passed away suddenly from this. Most often it's in kind of the 7 to 15 years old kind of range. Wow. And so for the other children, they knew them. They knew their personality. They were in school with them. They had school friends. And from a community, it just has, it's hard to say, and I don't want to diminish when infants die, but maybe perhaps a larger community effect.
I'm kind of interested in, in the Mennonite, obviously their religion is the focal point, of their family and of their community. What were they telling you? This is very unusual. What did they think the reason for it was? Did they have any idea at all? Did they think that it had something to do, for instance, with God's will, or that they were being, sorted out unfairly, by the Lord? Or what did they say?
Well, I think from our interactions with the Mennonite community, at least here in Iowa, and then the ones from Wisconsin and Missouri that have come to visit us as well, they just found it as a source of strength, really, their relationship with God. And so at least I've never heard them complain that they were being unfairly targeted. The one mother who lost the child that we first met, that Dr. Atkins first met, she would just say, the sting was very sharp at first, but over time has dulled. And that she misses him, but she knows that for her, she feels that he's with God and he's in heaven. And the longer that she's had to think about that, it's taken the sting out a little bit. Which I think for you and me, though, I don't know. I think there would... And we didn't get to meet or talk to the parents of the family that they lost 5 out of 7 children. But, so maybe they would have felt differently. But all the other ones that I've met have not felt cursed in any way, perhaps, or at least not openly about it, but more finding strength in God. And I think to a certain degree, too, they were, for several years, medicine wasn't as useful to them, not participating in the technological advances did not have such a big difference in their lives. But I feel like today, with modern medicine, it's making a bigger difference in their lives.
Yeah, I was interested in that part of it also. I mean, I don't want to generalize or label folks because that's a big mistake. It's never the right thing to do. And but when you think of the Mennonite community, you think of folks that are at least suspicious of technology. What was it like working with these folks? Did they, come around to your way of thinking quickly or slowly, or what was that process like?
Yeah, well, and I never met I met the family after Diane had done the first work with them, but with their second son, the one who survived cardiac arrest, I was very, very grateful for the technology, very grateful that he was awake and talking afterwards, after being in an ICU and being intubated and unable to move, for several days. The one technology that they really are dependent on, which is one of the most advanced technologies we have, is the implantable cardioverter defibrillator. It is an interesting thing, their relationship with that, because it is so advanced and it is very expensive. And so they don't participate in our typical health insurance programs. But they have a health insurance program they can participate in as a group. But even still, the out-of-pocket costs and things like that are very, very expensive for their community. And so they have had to navigate that. Now, as you said, I love that you said not making generalizations, because the families that we work with are Mennonite, a lot of them have cell phones, mostly flip phones. They'll usually have one or two per family, and that's it. A lot of them run, some of them run stores and things like that have limited electrical use. And some of them have chicken coops or turkey coops or pig operations, hog operations, where they're dependent somewhat on some technology. But for the most part, yeah, they're not heavily dependent on the technology. And then here they are, and they have a child who has a transmitter system that he keeps in his bedroom that they can hook up to their cell phone, and send us a transmission on the status of his device.
Yeah. It's a generalization, but I was always told that they're okay with wireless battery type things. They just don't like to be connected or corded, hooked up to a grid or something like that, dependent upon a line that goes to the community at large. Is that a part of this, do you think, or not?
Yeah, definitely. And then we have, and they make the distinction of that they're Mennonite and not the traditional Amish.
Yeah.
Although we have met some outside relatives who would consider themselves to be Amish. And the Amish individuals we've met, and in fact, one of them has a device for another reason. They don't even use cell phones. They don't use transmitters. The transmitter has to be at a neighbor's house that they walk to. And you can imagine that's a little bit inconvenient for the Amish identifying, because if your kid has some event and they pass out and you say, well, what happened? And they want to send us a transmission and see if we recorded something, then they have to somehow get him to another place, and make the choice between, do we take him to the hospital, or do we take him just to send a transmission? And it gets a little bit more challenging for them.
Well, this is interesting because, you've got the RYR2 gene that you've identified that's where the issue is. That's where the problem is. Now, it's knowledge is power. It's one thing to know something, and it's another thing to do something about it. So you've got these defibrillators, these implants that can keep these kids alive, but just the knowledge of what this is beneficial. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so, and we've had a fair number of discussions within the last 6 months or so with at least 3 families about this in the group. We have some history of this with the, and I always mispronounce this, but it's the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And they now have a program where they do genetic testing before you get married. And they have a similar problem that a Mennonite group would have, which is small groups and marriage, intermarriage, and endogamy. So they're just marrying within their groups. And so what they have is they have a lot of recessive genes that are are building up. And in this case, that's what this is. This is, you have to have 2 bad copies of the ryanodine receptor mutation, one from your mother, one from your father. And with those 2 bad copies, you get the disease. So far, everyone who has just 1 bad copy in a typical recessive manner has no disease at all. And so one thing, if you look at the little pedigrees, and I say little, it's actually 4 feet long. Hannah Bombay has had to handwrite it to a certain degree, and because computer programs had a hard time with how big it was. But every time you see a double line, and there's a lot of double lines, double line right there, that means that we know that that husband and wife have some relatives. They are related to each other. And for the most part, they're not marrying their first cousins or even their second cousins. But if you marry a third cousin, but that third cousin is related to you in 2 ways, then you start to develop a lot of recessive genes. So we have talked with the families recently about, would genetic testing before someone gets married be useful? Because then you would know, am I a carrier and are they a carrier? And then you would know that, your children have a 25% chance of getting the disease. So,
Wow.
But it's interesting they don't feel comfortable with that yet, and maybe I wouldn't either. So they have a child with an ICD in, and then we talk to them about genetic testing to protect future generations, and they say, we don't know about using technology like that. So it's something that they have to think about.
Yeah, and well, one thing about it, and I think back to my own family, they know who they are. They know their families. They know their lineage. They got probably family trees inside their Bibles. That's a big deal with them. So, some families might have difficulty keeping track of all this stuff, but I'll bet those folks won't. Well, now, what's next? I think of you, and I think of this team that worked on this. My God, this is a feel-good story. This is a win-win for everybody involved. You're still somewhat of a young man in medicine starting out here. This has got to be, very rewarding. You guys got to be feeling really good about this, I would imagine.
Yeah. So the next step actually is convincing the companies, the commercial companies, to include this as a pathogenic variant. And the companies already are considering that. But the nice thing about that is if they find it anywhere else where you have 2 bad copies like this, then they can let other people know that might not even be part of this population that it is likely to cause disease. And you could protect maybe some future individuals. The other thing we need to look at is while we were doing these very large pedigrees, our genetic counselor identified several other disorders that are tracking recessively through the families. So that's a story maybe for other groups, but we have bleeding disorders that are tracking. We have congenital heart disease where children are born with only 1 ventricle. We have abdominal heterotaxy, which is another rare and uncommon disease, but in them it's more common. And it may be something where if we identify genes related to it, that we could, again, you would test people before they get married, or at least before they have children, and say, what is your risk? One other thing that is very, very interesting about this is how rapid it was from when we identified the VUS, the variant of unknown significance, in the ryanodine receptor, to when we had good evidence that it was disease causing. So that happened in about 2, maybe 2.5 years. And it could have happened quicker, perhaps if you have a very controlled environment, but obviously they live far apart, Missouri and Wisconsin and Iowa. But it really tells a story about the families. As soon as we said, the more people we can genetically test with our colleagues at the Mayo Clinic, faster we can do this. And we had hundreds of samples within that year that were then tested. So a lot of times you identify something like this in other families that aren't a close society like that. And it might be 5 or 10 years before it gets figured out. And in this case, we have good evidence within 2, almost 3 years. So we would potentially do that as well for some of the other disorders and diseases. I think one limiting factor with that is that some of the other recessive disorders and diseases that are tracking through the families lead to children dying at a very young age and not having their own children. And so, to some degree, you're limited in who you could genetically test just by the fact that they don't survive long enough to have their own children. But
Well, I know this has been talked about, and it sounds like it may be on the horizon someday. Instead of folks, just chasing their family lineage through Ancestry.com or something like that, you'll go in for genetic testing before you get married, or certainly before you decide to have children, and be able to get a propensity or even a percentage or something on some of these strange diseases like ALS, MS, even things like the propensity for Alzheimer's and things like that. I mean, is that on the horizon?
I think it's on the horizon. We've already seen it with some diseases that have decreased in the incidence in the population. Some of the muscular dystrophies, they've tracked the family lines to and identified who the carriers are. And some people have chosen not to have children already, or to do surrogacy or donated ova or whatever it might be, so that they might have children, but they would no longer pass on this mutation, or at least the risk for whatever disease. So yeah, I think you're right. We're on the cusp of it.
And it's a big deal for me personally, Mark. My sister died of ALS, and they're still don't know exactly what that was all about. They know, that brothers and sisters have a slightly familial type percentage increase, likelihood of developing it or something like that. But it would be big in the field of ALS research. Well, on these podcasts, I always give folks the last word. What would you say just here to summarize it as we go out? And again, about your work and what you're doing out there in this particular case, if you want to comment on that or what you're looking at next.
So I would just say, I guess I was very pleased in all of this that the family and the teams of researchers, I mean, this is a large group effort, and it's paid off and hopefully has helped us to identify future cases before they become a problem. And just a shout out to the companies that made the defibrillators. We use lots of different companies that do them, and we have two of the siblings that have survived multiple times because their defibrillators work so well. So I'm glad their technology works and gives us a great tool for people that we can't otherwise fix the problem.
Yeah, and a shout out to our political leaders to make it possible that folks can afford them and buy them and get this insurance straightened out so that they can get tested and treated. You mentioned the interesting situation with that, and I want to thank you again for coming on the podcast. That's Mark Olson, folks. He's a physician's assistant at the University of Iowa, and he worked with that Mennonite community to do this discovery, which is great. I mean, he's a super sleuth, this guy. I'm telling you, he's a true detective of the medical profession. Well, that's going to do it. We're going to wrap it up. Check us out, as I always say, on all of the various platforms. Podcast by George is on everything from iTunes to YouTube to Twitter to Facebook. You can get us just about any platform where podcasts are seen or heard. But for right now, that's another podcast by George.